Be agreed to, and I call the Honourable Member for Perth.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I started today at 5 a.m. and, like many people in this place, I don't wake up with today. I'm no longer a member of the Sunrise family. I wake up with ABC Kids. And so I am here for our friends, Jemima, Big Ted, B1 and B2, and, of course, the Healer family. Chili, Bandit, Bingo, and Bluey. This national institution has been one of the key parts of the education of the Australian people, and most importantly, the next generation and so many generations of Australians. The ABC has given us that common Australian identity. It's given us the language, it's given us the stories of our country. It has educated children, it has educated people in this place, and as the member for Lilley was just saying, it's given many of us that one moment, that 15 minutes of fame, that opportunity to be on Mr Squiggle. And probably unknowing it, as I sat and watched Mr Squiggle, I probably saw the member for Lilley's fabulous whale, but didn't recognise the supreme political talent behind that whale. Indeed, I was very excited when my Mr Squiggle was declared to be upside down, and there appeared an emu with yo-yos. It was one of the highlights of my childhood. And the ABC gives highlights to so many children from all over Australia, regional, cities, and even Australians abroad. Indeed, it was a piece of bipartisan commitment to create ABC Kids, or ABC3 as they're known. It was an idea that had bounced around the Howard government for many years. It was ultimately grabbed as an election commitment of the Rudd opposition, and then, with great joy, it was a bipartisan initiative in that government. It is a truly special thing that we should treasure a lot more than we do at times in this place. When we talk about the ABC and its commitment to regions, I note that there are 8 regional hubs of the ABC in Western Australia alone: Albany, Broome, Bunbury, Esperance, Geraldton, Kalgoorlie, Karratha and Kununurra. And each of those ABC hubs does a fabulous job, not just for those communities, but for hundreds and hundreds of kilometres around. And I also acknowledge that in my seat of Perth stands a great example of the bipartisan support the ABC has received over the years. I pay absolute tribute to the Howard government for building the new ABC studio that sits in East Perth. It is a fabulous studio. I know many of the people who had worked at the old ABC studios that had gone well and truly beyond their prime, and it is something that I give due respect to Prime Minister Howard and his government for. You might be mistaken in looking at this legislation to think that there is no ABC presence in the regions or in rural Australia. There are 46 ABC offices in non-capital city locations across this country. That is more than the federal National Party has across this country. And I noticed that the National Party did have their conference here in Canberra on the weekend, and in Western Australia they recently moved their headquarters from my electorate of Perth, which I'd be surprised if the National Party was to say was in rural or regional Australia. Indeed, but they did. I'll give them credit. The National Party did move their offices to the regional town of Claremont in the electorate of Curtin. Now, there are clearly some Nationals Party members who are confused about how active the ABC is in the country, but I assure you there is no confusion on this side of the House just how committed the ABC is to our regions. Now, I spoke about one of the most viewed, most loved, most popular 6-year-olds in the country. Bluey, the Blue Healer, who is on our screens of all shapes and sizes more often than most parents would care to admit. Bluey has taken this country and soon the world by storm because of our national broadcaster. Bluey will be one of our biggest cultural exports, and it's because of the ABC's focus on children's entertainment. I would argue Bluey over time will be more culturally meaningful than Crocodile Dundee. And I think Bluey over time will be a more popular export to the United Kingdom than Kylie Minogue. The ABC is also consistently one of the most trusted institutions in this country. Most surveys show that the work of the ABC, the reporting of the ABC, is the most trusted Australian news source. And there's a reason for that. Indeed, I know that the ABC is often more trusted in many ways than many of us in this place. But it's also because the ABC is one of the only places that you can see so many pieces of this great country. For years, it was only the ABC that would broadcast the waffle into Perth homes. And it was so important that they shared, because it's not just about sharing the stories, but it's also about sharing the aspirations and the excitement of young sports players. Indeed, the ABC does such an important job in that. The ABC is one of the biggest promoters of the arts in Australia. I've spoken a lot about the ABC's amazing work in children's television. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation is one of the loudest and most diverse voices when it comes to Indigenous affairs. And while I would argue that this legislation probably isn't the most important piece of legislation that we will deal with in this term, I know that the ABC is going to play an incredibly important role as this country marches slowly towards constitutional recognition for Indigenous Australians. And, as I mentioned earlier, the ABC is a strong voice for regional and rural Australia. We shouldn't discuss this legislation without context. The cumulative effect over the course of the last decade of almost $800 million in cuts to the ABC's budget. These cuts are real. These cuts have affected the ability of the ABC to do its work. But I would also note that it was not one person who made these cuts. There's not much that would unite former Prime Ministers Abbott, former Prime Minister Turnbull and the current Prime Minister. But when it comes to $800 million of cuts to the ABC, you have absolute unity amongst the three of them. In July, the ABC started to feel the full impact of the three-year $83.8 million indexation freeze. Now, indexation freezing is one of the most gutless ways to cut the budget of an organisation. We saw it with the indexation freeze on Medicare. We see it when the indexation freeze on the ABC. When you interfere with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, year in, year out, it does affect its ability to invest in long-term programming. It affects the ABC's ability to plan about how do you expand the regional network, because you don't know whether that dollar is going to be there the next year. Unfortunately, interference in the ABC is becoming one of the highest priorities of the government. Now, we see that the government, over time, started to follow in the footsteps of One Nation, what was initially One Nation policy in saying you should expose the pay packets and the names of those who receive those salaries for ABC broadcasters. All of a sudden, that went from being One Nation policy to government policy. Former Communications Minister Mitch Fifield followed step by step the policy path set out for him by One Nation. That was a very disappointing attack to see from this government on our ABC. Now, I do feel for the ABC. They can't hold $700,000 fundraisers for the Liberal Party as Nine can, and no attack on Nine, but it is weird to be just 2 weeks on from that fundraiser discussing this legislation, which is an attack on the ABC. But of course, this isn't the biggest attack we've seen on the ABC. It was the Liberal Party's Federal Council that voted, quote, overwhelmingly in favour of Young Liberal bid, calling for the full privatisation of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Full privatisation? What a terrible idea that would not wash with any clear-thinking Australian. But of course, there was always the cutout, always the regional cutout as to not upset the National Party. It was, if I read the full motion, it was, this Liberal Federal Council calls for the, quote, full privatisation of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, comma, except for services into regional areas. What a terrible admission from the Liberal Party that their privatisation agenda actually is about reducing services for regional communities. I worry that as we start to tweak and change the ABC's charter to talk more about regional obligations, this may in fact be the first step in privatising the ABC, which we now know is the Liberal Party of Australia's stated policy preference. Now, I would give some credit to the Friends of the ABC. I know that our ABC today is stronger because of the work of the Friends of the ABC. I've campaigned alongside them year in, year out. They do fabulous work protecting and advocating for our national broadcaster. It's also important that we preserve the role of the ABC internationally. Our international correspondents, often working in war zones, in post-conflict environments, providing some of the most useful reporting that's relied on in this place on some of those largest national security and foreign policy discussions that we have. And we get to press freedom. The challenge of making sure that we protect the ABC's independence is also upon us when we talk about press freedom. A free press is a basic human right. It's been defended consistently since the creation of UNESCO, or the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, in 1945. Indeed, we know that a free press was essential in the conflicts that Australia has participated in, including in Afghanistan, activities in East Timor and, of course, Iraq. In this place, it's important that we continue to defend the value of a free press and also recognise that these are active. This is not something that just happens in war zones, that challenge of free press. The challenge of free press is something that we face and debate in this place on a daily basis. I'd back in what ABC Chair Ita Buttrose said in saying that bipartisan support for press freedom is critical after police raids at the public broadcaster. When the police raid a public broadcaster, you do have to ask the tough questions. You have to make sure that you are defending a free press, indeed, particularly a free press for the public broadcaster. And when you look at the detail of this legislation, we should ask, is it necessary? That should always be the first question. Why is this one of the first bills that is brought into this parliament? Indeed, the quote that sticks out for me from the Parliamentary Library's own analysis is, and it says, quote, "Neither the explanatory memorandum to the bill nor the Minister's second reading speech identify a specific policy problem or issue, bracket, for example, a service gap, in bracket, that the bill is seeking to address." The Minister's second reading speech didn't identify a specific policy problem that this bill is trying to address. And of course, the ABC Charter already very clearly states the functions of the corporation are to provide within Australia innovative and comprehensive broadcasting services consisting of national, commercial and community sectors. This isn't media reform. It has no purpose other than to attack the ABC and to undermine the ABC. Indeed, I note that some of my colleagues in a Senate inquiry in 2017 said that this bill is unwarranted, misguided, duplicative and costly. And when there's so many things that we could be investing in for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and so many things we could be doing to enhance it for the possibilities of new technologies, to instead have this, this is essentially red tape. I don't think it will be repealed at any of the government's red tape repeal days in the near future, but this is just red tape on the ABC, who in fact they don't need red tape, they just need more funding. And that's the fact of it. If you want to look after the regions, spend more money on the ABC, and this bill would be completely unnecessary if the government did fund the ABC properly. And I'll just finish by agreeing with what the member for Lilley said. This is legislation for quotas. Quotas are apparently good enough for the ABC, not good enough for the Liberal Party. Quotas are good enough for the Prime Minister's Department, not good enough for the Prime Minister's candidates. This legislation is unnecessary and doesn't address any specific problem.